Well, good morning and welcome to First Baptist Church of Bryson City, our 9 a.m. live stream Bible study. This is our third Sunday in the Easter season. It's the seventh Sunday of online services that we've been having due to our current situation. This is our third week celebrating resurrection and thinking about what resurrection means for our lives today. So our question is, how does resurrection really affect our lives? That's what we're celebrating and looking at during this season following Easter. So welcome, and we're glad you're with us today. It is Bible study, so I invite you to have a Bible and have something there to take notes with as we go today. Our scripture today that we're looking at is Luke, the Gospel of Luke, chapter 24, verses 13 to 35. Luke 24, 13 to 35. Is this all on the screen, Brad? Can you tell?
I think so.
Okay. We think you can see all this. This is our scripture today, and I've been studying the scripture, reading the book of Luke this week and reading this passage and seeing how this passage relates to all of the other material in Luke's gospel. And also been reading what other people write about this. Some of the people that I've leaned on this week for material and study are scholars like Marva Dawn, Fred Craddock, and Alan Culpepper, to name just a few. Those are some folks that I like to read to see what they're thinking and writing about these passages. Alan Culpepper says that this story is like a rich mine. It's something that we keep coming back to get load after load of treasures. So let's dig in here this morning. We're in Luke chapter 24, and to summarize what's been going on up to this point, back up to chapter 22. In Luke, Jesus has been in Jerusalem for a few days and preparing for the Passover feast. And he tells his disciples to go and prepare a place for the Passover feast. And they have that meal together, and that's when we have what we call the Lord's Supper, where Jesus institutes that. Then they leave from there. They go to the Garden of Gethsemane. And at that point, Judas betrays Jesus, and Jesus experiences being arrested. Then he experiences the trials throughout the night before the Jewish leaders and before the Roman leaders, being passed back and forth. And finally, he is given the sentence of crucifixion and begins his walk to the cross. Luke records the incident of Simon of Cyrene helping carry the cross. And Jesus is crucified. And then he's put in his body is laid in the tomb, and he's buried there in the tomb. And now we're in chapter 24, and the ladies go and they experience the resurrection. They find this empty tomb, and they run back to tell other disciples. And now, here in verse 13 of chapter 24, we have two of these disciples, and they're making the journey it's a 7-mile walk from Jerusalem to their village of Emmaus. And it's the same day. These two disciples are walking, and they're talking back and forth about what all's been happening. Remember last week we talked about those very possible feelings of grief, of loss of their leader, of sadness, maybe some anger with the authorities, feelings of confusion, them trying to figure out what's going on. And they're talking back and forth on the road there. And Jesus comes along beside them and begins talking with them, but they cannot see him. They can't recognize who Jesus is. Until they get close to the village, they invite Jesus in. He stays with them. And when he breaks the bread, their eyes are opened, and they see who Jesus is in this passage. So first, some of the things that Luke does here are very interesting. In verse 13, the first words that you see there, in my translation it says, "and behold." It's one word in the Greek, And some of the translations that we have nowadays really soften this. It'll say, now two of them were walking along, or so two of them were walking along. Almost missed that. But this phrase translated, and behold, it has a lot more power to it. In the Greek, Luke is saying, he's saying, it's very emphatic. See, look here. We might say something like, now get this, or listen up, listen to me, or you won't see what I'm getting ready to tell you. So just like in this passage where these disciples walking with Jesus couldn't recognize who he was, Luke is kind of saying, listen up, or you won't see what I'm saying either. Luke goes on in this passage to use a literary tool of irony. And you can think of irony a lot of ways, but I think of it here today as when the opposite of what you are expecting is what is actually true. And there's three instances of that here that is woven into this text that Luke uses to help get our attention. First, we'll look in verses 16 and 17. They're walking along the road and they're talking back and forth to each other. But their eyes were prevented from recognizing him. And he said to them, Jesus is right there. He's speaking to them. But yet they don't see him. They're prevented from recognizing him. Something that's plain as day, but they just don't see it. Earlier in Luke, I've got an example of this that I'll share with you. Luke chapter 9, verse 18. Look there. Luke 9, 18. We're also going to look at verse 20 and 22. And I'll turn there in my Bible while you're turning in your copy of the Scriptures. Luke 9, 18. Luke 9, 18. It says, and it happened that while he was praying alone, the disciples were with him, and he questioned them, saying, who do people say that I am? Luke is getting at who is this Christ and what is his purpose. And they give an answer. In verse 20, he says, and he said to them, but who do you say that I am? And they give an answer. And Peter says, you're the Christ, you're the Messiah. And Jesus says in verse 22 there then, the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and scribes and be killed and be raised up on the third day. Jesus says that very plainly of what kind of Messiah he is. So there it is. He's speaking to them in chapter 9. It's plain as day, but yet they don't see it. They don't get it, what kind of Messiah he has come to be for them. So a few questions for us at this point. What is it that keeps us from seeing Jesus? They may have been experiencing grief. Is there grief in our lives or something sad that threatens to overwhelm us? They may have been experiencing anger. Is there anger in our lives that blinds us from what's really going on? We use the phrase sometimes, at least folks growing up around me would say, I'm so angry I can't see straight. We lose our focus in our anger sometimes. And confusion. Sometimes are we so disoriented by something that we're confused? What is it that is in our life that keeps us from seeing Jesus? Something to think about there. So there's more irony in the story here. In verse 18, One of them, named Cleopas, answered and said to him, "Are you the only one visiting Jerusalem, unaware of the things which have happened here in these days?" And that was, Jesus had asked him, "What are you talking about as you're walking along?" And he says, "Are you the only one that doesn't know what's happened in these days?" And their question in itself assumes that Jesus is the only one who doesn't know what's going on, when in reality, Jesus is the only one who really does know what is going on. They didn't get how or why this person that they thought would be the Messiah would have to suffer and die. They didn't get the suffering part. In verse 25, part of Jesus' response, you can see, he says, "O foolish men and slow of heart to believe in all that the prophets have spoken. Was it not necessary for the Christ to suffer these things and to enter into his glory?" They didn't get the suffering part, and often maybe we don't either. In Luke 18:31 is a more example of that. 31. Do I have an ending through 34? Luke 18:31 to 34. My hands are dry and it's hard to turn the pages. Then he took the 12 aside and said to them, "Behold, we're going up to Jerusalem, and all things which are written through the prophets about the Son of Man will be accomplished. For he will be handed over to the Gentiles, and he will be mocked and mistreated and spit upon, and after they have scourged him, they will kill him, and the third day he will rise again." But the disciples understood none of these things, and the meaning of this statement was hidden from them, and they did not comprehend the things that were said. They didn't get it. Jesus said it very plainly what was going to happen to him, and we're told that they didn't understand. And then I think it's interesting that the very next story and the very next phrase begins with, "As Jesus was approaching Jericho, a blind man was sitting on the road." Another person who could not see. One more ironic thing that I spotted in this text here in my studies, verses 18 through 21. 18 through 21, Cleophas answered him, "Are you the only one visiting that doesn't know what's happening?" And Jesus just says, "What? What things? What are you talking about?" And then the two disciples, it says they respond to him, and they give this long response to Jesus' short question of what. I think they're probably both trying to tell each other's story, maybe interrupting each other to tell the story here, and because it says they both responded to him. But here's what they said. And they said to him, "The things about Jesus the Nazarene, who was a prophet, mighty in deed and word in the sight of God and all the people, and how the chief priests and our rulers delivered him to the sentence of death and crucified him. But we were hoping that it was he who was going to redeem Israel. Indeed, besides all this, it is the third day since these things have happened. We were hoping that he was the one who was going to redeem Israel." His death, which they saw as ending God's redemption of their people, was really the way that God had chosen to redeem their people and all people. So the last little bit of irony there, what they thought was the end was really God's choice on how to redeem all people. So a few more questions for reflection based on those thoughts. How do they and how do we begin to understand what God is up to today, even in suffering, even in challenges, even in those hard times? How do we begin to understand that? And how do we begin to understand it? And maybe it's even more important to say, how do we begin to be formed into the likeness of Christ? How do we begin to live as Jesus lived? As Christians, we intend to be Christ followers. We intend to be reflections of Christ, little Christs. So how do we begin to understand, and how do we begin to live and be formed into the likeness of Christ, even in suffering, even in challenging times? Well, the rest of this passage gives us some ideas about that. And I told you I read other people. Marva Dawn gives 3 points here that I want to relate to you. And if you know Marva Dawn, you know that she is a person that understands suffering. You can read her biographical information, look her up online. She gives us 3 points, 3 gifts that Jesus gives them and gives to us to help us to be formed into the likeness of Christ. Look in verse 27. This is the first gift. Jesus is responding to these disciples walking along, beginning with Moses and with all the prophets. He explained to them the things concerning himself in all the scriptures. The gift of the scriptures. Jesus shows how all the things that those disciples considered scripture at the time, how that narrative, how that story led to him and what he was doing, what God was doing through Christ, this Messiah, Jesus. And I've said it several times on this live stream, the resources at BibleProject.com, I just encourage you to go there in your time this week and look through those videos. One of their taglines on BibleProject.com is that the Bible is one unified story that leads to Jesus. And as you look at those short videos, they pull the story together and how it all leads to Jesus. So we have the gift of Scripture to help us be formed into the likeness of Christ. Secondly, we have His presence. Look at verses 28 and 29, especially the last part of verse 29. They approached the village where they were going, and he, Jesus, acted as though he was going farther, but they urged him, saying, "Stay with us, for it's getting toward evening, and the day is now nearly over." So he went in to stay with them. Jesus was present with them. He stayed with them. So we have the Scriptures. We also know that God is with us. The Spirit of God is with us too. So the Scriptures, His presence, and finally, the gift of the bread and the cup as reminders to us of the body and the blood of Christ. Verses 30 and 31, when he had reclined at the table with them, he took the bread and blessed it, and breaking it, he began giving it to them. Then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him. That is the moment they recognized him. Compare that with the same wording in Luke 22:19. Back at that Passover meal, just a few days before, and no doubt other times before, as Jesus had been with his disciples eating. Chapter 22, verse 19. They're having the Passover meal. And he gets to the part where he has the bread. And when he had taken some bread, And giving thanks, he broke it and gave it to them, saying, "This is my body, which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." He took the bread, he gave thanks, and he broke it. And here, in this home in the village of Emmaus, when he reclined at the table, he took the bread and blessed it and broke it. And that's when their eyes were opened. So, finally, their eyes were opened. And ours can be too. If we think about these gifts of the Scripture, the presence of God with us wherever we are today, in our homes or wherever we may be, and in the reminders of His body and blood in the bread and the cup that we celebrate. Some Christian traditions celebrate weekly or every time that they gather. Here at First Baptist Church, we celebrate 16 times a year, once each quarter in our corporate worship and once each month on the first Tuesday of the month. We remember, as Jesus asks us to remember, His body and His blood and the way that God chose to redeem this world. So, thanks for joining us today. We've dug out one small load of the treasure, the material out of this mine this morning. So I hope that it's been helpful to you, and you can reflect on your notes and the ideas here that we've opened up. And I hope that throughout this week and to the rest of today and throughout the week, that we'll keep coming back to dig for more and seek God's guidance to become the people that He's called us to be and created us to be. Thank you.